A racist Karen called 911 to frame a black man, sure her lie would ruin his life. But when he revealed he was a renowned attorney, her plan unraveled spectacularly, and the fallout was more devastating than she ever imagined. It was a bright afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Birds chirped in the trees, and children's laughter echoed faintly from a park nearby. James Carter, a poised and humble black man in his late 30s, was standing by his car in front of a small local cafe. He wore a tailored suit, his briefcase resting on the hood of his sleek sedan. To anyone watching, it was clear he was a professional, perhaps on his way to an important meeting. But for one particular neighbor, this scene sparked suspicion. Across the street, Karen Hall, known for her quick temper and penchant for stirring drama, watched from her window, her face twisted with disdain. Her gaze narrowed as she stared at James, her mind racing with baseless assumptions. "What's he doing here?" she muttered to herself, pulling out her phone. Karen had always thought of herself as the unofficial watchdog of the neighborhood, though many would call her meddlesome at best. In her eyes, James didn't belong. His polished appearance and calm demeanor didn't matter. To Karen, the color of his skin was enough to convince her he was up to no good. Without hesitation, she dialed 911, her voice frantic as she exaggerated the situation. "There's a suspicious man outside," she said, her tone laced with fear she didn't truly feel. "He's loitering, looking into cars. He might be planning to rob someone. Please, send someone quickly." James, oblivious to the brewing storm, calmly reviewed his notes for an upcoming court case. He was deeply focused, unaware that Karen was watching his every move, weaving a false narrative. Moments later, the piercing sound of sirens shattered the neighborhood's peace. 2 police cars pulled up, and officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their holstered weapons. James looked up, startled by the sudden commotion. His calm demeanor shifted to confusion as the officers approached him, their expressions serious. "Sir, we got a call about suspicious activity in the area," one officer said firmly. "We need to ask you a few questions." James blinked, his professional instincts kicking in. "Suspicious activity?" he asked, his voice measured. "I'm just here reviewing some documents for work. Is there a problem?" From her porch, Karen appeared, arms crossed, her face smug. "That's him!" she called out. "I saw him pacing around, looking into cars. He doesn't belong here." James turned toward her, his eyes locking with hers. Her accusatory tone and the look of satisfaction on her face stung deeply, but James remained composed. He could feel the weight of the officer's scrutiny, the unspoken judgment in their eyes. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding," James said calmly. "I'm a lawyer. I have no reason to—" "Lawyer?" Karen interrupted with a scoff, her voice dripping with disbelief. "That's a good one. You think I'm going to fall for that?" The officers exchanged glances, one of them stepping closer to James. "We're going to need to see some identification," he said firmly. James sighed, his chest tightening. He reached into his briefcase slowly, pulling out his wallet. The scene felt surreal. Here he was, a respected attorney, being treated like a criminal because of a baseless accusation. As he handed over his ID, he glanced at Karen, who smirked, as if she had already won. One officer inspected James's ID, his brow furrowing as he read the credentials. "Wait a minute," the officer muttered, looking at James with a mix of surprise and uncertainty. "James Carter," the officer said aloud, his voice softening. "You're an attorney?" James nodded. "That's correct. I work with Carter and Associates downtown." His tone was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of frustration. Karen's face faltered for the first time, her smug expression replaced with confusion. "What?" she stammered, stepping closer. "That can't be right. He's lying." The officer handed the ID back to James, his tone more respectful now. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, sir. It seems there's no issue here." But the damage was done. James's heart sank as he looked around, realizing how easily a lie had escalated into this moment. He turned to Karen, who stood frozen, her face pale. "Your fear doesn't justify your lies," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with pain. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, she realized she might not be in control of what happened next. What Karen didn't realize was that this wasn't over. James wasn't just any attorney. He was one of the most skilled litigators in the state. And now, he was determined to hold her accountable for her actions. James stood silently for a moment, watching Karen's confidence crumble as the truth began to dawn on her. He could feel the weight of the moment, but he wasn't about to let her walk away from what she had done so easily. This wasn't just about him. It was about a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. Karen shifted nervously, her arms folded, as if trying to shield herself from the judgment radiating from James and even the officers. "Look," she stammered, "I didn't mean anything by it. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood." James tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Protect the neighborhood? From what exactly?" His tone was calm, but there was no mistaking the edge in his voice. Karen looked away, avoiding his gaze. I thought you might be doing something suspicious," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "Suspicious," James repeated, letting the word hang in the air. He gestured toward his car and briefcase. "Does reviewing legal documents in broad daylight look suspicious to you?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The officers, now fully aware of what had transpired, exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them finally spoke up. "Ma'am, it seems like there's been a misunderstanding here," he said carefully, though his tone carried a hint of reprimand. James straightened, his gaze never leaving Karen. "Misunderstanding," he said, his voice firm but composed. "A misunderstanding would be an accident. This was intentional. She made a false claim to 911 with the intent to harm me." Karen flinched at the word harm, her face reddening. "That's not true," she blurted out. "I was just trying to be cautious." James raised an eyebrow. "Cautious? No, you assumed. You assumed I didn't belong here because of how I look. And you weaponized the police against me, knowing full well what could happen." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, Karen seemed to grasp the gravity of her actions. She looked at the officers, searching for support, but they remained silent. One of the officers cleared his throat. "Sir, if you'd like to file a formal complaint, we can assist you." James nodded slightly. "Oh, I'll be taking action," he said. "But not just with a complaint. This goes deeper than that." Karen's eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. "Wait, what does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. James turned to her, his expression resolute. "It means you don't get to walk away from this unscathed. Actions have consequences, and it's time you face yours." Karen took a step back, her composure crumbling. "You're blowing this out of proportion. I didn't mean for it to go this far." James tilted his head slightly, his gaze piercing. "Karen, the moment you picked up that phone and lied to the police, you meant for it to go as far as it could. You just didn't think you'd get caught." The officers, sensing the tension, stepped back toward their cars, but not before one handed James a card. "Let us know if you need anything further," the officer said quietly, his tone almost apologetic. As the police left, James looked at Karen one last time. "You'll be hearing from me soon," he said simply, before turning to his car. Karen stood frozen on the sidewalk, her mind racing. The smirk she once wore was gone, replaced by a deep, gnawing fear. Karen thought she could move on from the incident, but what she didn't know was that James was already preparing to take her to court. And when her past came to light, It would reveal a shocking history she never wanted anyone to see. Karen paced nervously in her living room, clutching her phone tightly. Her social media accounts were flooded with comments after someone had recorded the incident and shared it online. The video, showing her accusing James and his calm yet pointed response, had gone viral. The caption read, "Racist Karen gets exposed by top attorney." The comments were relentless. She tried to ruin his life and ended up ruining her own. Karma. How many people has she done this to before? She needs to face real consequences for this. Karen turned off her phone with a trembling hand, her chest tightening as the weight of public scrutiny bore down on her. She hadn't slept in 2 days, constantly refreshing her notifications, hoping the storm would pass. But deep down, she knew this wasn't something she could outrun. Across town, James was sitting in his office, surrounded by legal documents. His assistant handed him a thick folder. "This is everything we could find on her," she said, her tone serious. James opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. What he found didn't surprise him, but it still sent a chill down his spine. Karen Hall had a history. Over the past decade, she had filed numerous complaints against her neighbors, most of them people of color. In one instance, she had accused a young Latino man of trespassing because he was walking his dog near her property. In another, she had called the police on a black teenager selling lemonade, claiming he didn't have a permit. Each time her complaints had been dismissed, but the pattern was undeniable. James leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "She's been using the system as a weapon for years," he muttered. His assistant nodded. "It's not just her history with the police. A few of her former neighbors described her as a bully. She's had multiple restraining orders filed against her for harassment." James tapped the folder thoughtfully. "This is exactly what we need. She's built her life on targeting and intimidating others. It's time someone put a stop to it." Meanwhile, Karen was desperate to regain control of the situation. She reached out to a lawyer, hoping to preempt any legal action from James. Her lawyer, a middle-aged man named Steve, listened patiently as she rambled about how this whole thing has been blown out of proportion. "I didn't do anything wrong," Karen insisted. "I was just being cautious. He's the one making this into a big deal." Steve sighed, folding his hands on the desk. "Karen, the video is damning. And if what I've heard about James Carter is true, he's not someone to take lightly. He's known for winning cases like this." Karen's face paled. "But I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Can't you just, I don't know, make it go away?" Steve shook his head. "It's not that simple. If he decides to pursue legal action, we'll have to prepare for a tough fight. And with your history—" Karen froze. "What history?" Steve opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her. It displayed a news article with the headline, "Pattern of Bias. Neighborhood complaints raise questions about Karen Hall's motives." Karen's stomach dropped as she read the article, which detailed her previous complaints and interactions with law enforcement. "This can't be happening," she whispered. Steve leaned forward. "You need to understand something, Karen. This isn't just about one mistake. This is about a pattern of behavior that's finally caught up to you." James and his team worked late into the night, building their case. He wasn't interested in just winning. He wanted to make sure Karen's actions sent a message. He prepared to file a lawsuit for defamation and emotional distress, knowing that her false 911 call had put his safety at risk. But it wasn't just about him. James also reached out to community leaders and legal advocates to discuss broader issues of racial profiling and misuse of emergency services. "This isn't just a personal matter," he told them. "This is a systemic problem, and people like Karen think they can keep getting away with it." As the lawsuit was filed and the news spread, Karen's life began to unravel further. But the real shock came when James decided to make his next move, one that would expose her to the entire community in a way she never anticipated. Karen sat on her couch, scrolling through her phone in disbelief. News outlets had picked up the story of her false accusation, and the headline plastered across multiple screens was unrelenting. Attorney sues Karen Hall for racial profiling and defamation. Her lawyer, Steve, called shortly after the news broke. "Karen, it's worse than we thought," he said bluntly. "James Carter isn't just filing a lawsuit, he's making this a public case. He's drawing attention to the broader issue of racial profiling, and you're at the center of it." Karen's heart sank. "What does that even mean?" Steve sighed heavily. "He's partnered with legal advocacy groups and is using this as an opportunity to raise awareness. They're calling for systemic change, and your name is attached to everything. This is no longer just a lawsuit, it's a movement." Karen threw her phone onto the couch, her hands trembling. "I didn't ask for this. This isn't fair." Steve's voice was firm. "What's not fair, Karen, is the position you put yourself in. James has every right to pursue this. We need to focus on damage control before this gets worse." James stood at a podium in a packed community center, flanked by local activists and legal experts. Cameras flashed as he addressed a room filled with reporters and concerned citizens. "What happened to me isn't an isolated incident," James began, his voice steady but impassioned. "Every day, people of color face false accusations and racial profiling, often with life-threatening consequences. It's time we hold people accountable for weaponizing the justice system against marginalized communities." The room erupted into applause as James continued. "Karen Hall's actions are part of a much larger issue. That's why this lawsuit isn't just about me. It's about sending a message that this kind of behavior will no longer be tolerated." A reporter raised their hand. "Mr. Carter, what are you hoping to achieve with this lawsuit?" James paused, his expression resolute. "Accountability and change. Karen Hall needs to face the consequences of her actions. But more importantly, this case should serve as a warning to others. Racial profiling isn't just wrong. It's dangerous, and it has to stop." As James's words reverberated through the media, Karen found herself under siege. Protesters gathered outside her home, holding signs that read, "No justice, no peace," and "Stop weaponizing 911." Her social media accounts were flooded with angry messages, and she couldn't even go to the grocery store without feeling the weight of judgmental stares. Karen's carefully curated world of comfort and control was crumbling. She turned on the TV, hoping for some distraction, but every channel seemed to be covering the lawsuit. A legal analyst dissected the case, saying, "This could set a powerful precedent. If James Carter wins, it could deter others from making false accusations based on race." Karen buried her head in her hands, her breath shaky. For the first time, she realized that her actions had far-reaching consequences, not just for her, but for her family, her reputation, and even her future. In court, James's legal team laid out a meticulous case, using Karen's history of false accusations to demonstrate a clear pattern of racial bias. Witnesses from her past came forward to testify about her behavior, painting a damning picture of someone who had long abused her privilege. But the turning point came when James himself took the stand. With quiet strength, he recounted the fear and humiliation he felt during the incident. "In that moment, I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't a man with a career or a future. I was just another black man being accused of something I didn't do. That's the power of a lie like Karen's. It can strip you of your humanity in an instant." The courtroom fell silent as his words hung in the air. Even Karen, sitting at the defense table, couldn't meet his gaze. As the trial drew to a close, the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. But just when Karen thought she had faced the worst, James revealed a final piece of evidence that would leave everyone, including her, utterly stunned. The courtroom was packed as the judge returned to deliver the verdict. Karen sat at the defense table, her hands clenched tightly together. She looked worn and exhausted, the weight of the trial and public scrutiny etched into her face. James sat across the room, his demeanor calm but resolute, flanked by his legal team. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the tension. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies presented in this case, it is clear that the defendant's actions were not only reckless, but malicious. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. James Carter. A murmur rippled through the room as the judge continued. Ms. Hall is hereby ordered to pay $250,000 in damages for defamation and emotional distress. Furthermore, this court refers her actions for investigation under misuse of emergency services statutes, which may result in additional penalties. Karen's mouth fell open. She stammered, "This can't be happening. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The judge's gaze was stern as he addressed her. "Ms. Hall, intent does not absolve you of responsibility. Your actions could have led to serious consequences, and this court will not tolerate the abuse of law enforcement resources or the targeting of individuals based on race." Karen's lawyer placed a hand on her arm, but she shrugged him off. Her world was crumbling around her, and she had no one to blame but herself. As reporters gathered outside the courthouse, Karen tried to avoid the cameras, but James stepped confidently into the spotlight. He held a briefcase in one hand, a calm smile on his face. One reporter shouted, "Mr. Carter, how do you feel about the verdict?" James adjusted his tie and replied, "Today's verdict is a step toward accountability, but the work doesn't end here. Cases like this are all too common, and too often they go unchallenged. I'm grateful that the court recognized the gravity of this situation, but my goal is to ensure no one else has to go through what I did." Then, with a measured pause, he added, "And that's why I've decided to donate the damages awarded to an organization fighting racial injustice and advocating for reform in emergency service misuse cases." The crowd gasped. Even Karen, standing in the shadow of the courthouse, froze at his words. "This was never about the money," James continued. "It was about making sure people like Karen understand that their actions have consequences, not just for their victims, but for themselves, and it's about making our communities safer for everyone." Karen's life was never the same after the trial. She lost her job when her employer, under pressure from public outrage, decided her behavior didn't align with their values. Her home, once a place of comfort and control, became a prison of shame and isolation. Neighbors avoided her, and stores stopped welcoming her. She became a pariah in her community, her name forever associated with her actions. But what haunted her most wasn't the financial penalty or the public shame. It was the realization that her actions had deeply hurt someone she had never even taken the time to know. For James, the trial's outcome was more than a personal victory. It was a catalyst for change. His case inspired new discussions around racial profiling and 911 misuse, and laws were proposed to hold individuals accountable for false accusations with racial bias. He continued his work as an attorney, but took on a more public role, speaking at events and advocating for systemic reform. James knew the fight against injustice wasn't over, but he was committed to doing his part to create a world where stories like his were no longer a reality. As James walked through his neighborhood one evening, he passed by a group of kids playing basketball in the street. One young boy looked up and said, "Mr. Carter, my dad told me what you did. You're a hero." James smiled warmly, crouching to meet the boy's gaze. "You don't have to be a lawyer to stand up for what's right. You just need to have the courage to speak the truth." The boy nodded, his eyes wide with admiration, as James stood and continued walking, the sunset casting a warm glow over the street. For James, justice wasn't just about winning a case. It was about creating a legacy of hope and accountability. And in the end, that was the real victory.